as a way of welcoming people to our guest speaker. We said starting at 7, and I see people are coming in, and I know a few people have notified me they might be coming a bit late, students who have basketball practice or a class that they have to attend, and they're going to duck out and join us in the middle. But I want to thank everybody or welcome everybody for coming on a snowy night. This is, or at least windy and semi-snowy Nova Scotia night. This is one of the only good things about Zoom, that we're not as beholden to the weather. In any given year, we have to cross our fingers. And I know from past experience, we've had people who are coming in who man disposes, God proposes, or whatever that phrase is, and their flights get diverted from Halifax Airport. And anybody living up here knows something about that, which is probably why I set my default background to sunnier places. But I want to thank everybody for coming. This is our virtual visiting history lecturer, Dr. Marcus Rediker of the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm going to speak a bit or welcome him in again in a normal year. When we get back to that, we would of course have taken him to dinner, and we would have an after talk reception. But we will have an after talk lively question and answer. People can unmic themselves when we get to that point and ask questions, or if they're more comfortable, use the chat, and we'll field the questions that way. Before I introduce Dr. Rediker, I have to thank some people. Thank, of course, the history department, ourselves, for bringing him in, and thank Dr. Rediker for almost immediately saying, sure, I'd like to do this. But here at St. FX, we also were very fortunate to have some support that allowed us to put together this visiting lecture. So Dr. Kevin Walmsley, the academic vice president and provost, and his office provided some substantial materialist support for this talk, as did Karen Brebner. Dr. Brebner, the Dean of Arts, and her office helped us make this happen. And Dr. Matthias Nilgis from the McKenna Center for Leadership also kicked in. And we're very grateful, me personally and the history department, for the help in bringing this talk to fruition. Here is Dr. Rediker. I just read what he sent me. I could wing it and tell you he has been, I've never met him except virtually now, and I'm delighted this has happened. But he's a well-known scholar of multiple interesting topics: slavery, piracy, slave revolts, slave ships, early seafaring history, you name it. And the topic of today's talk, abolitionism. Dr. Marcus Rediker is Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. His 10 books have won numerous awards, been translated into 16 languages. The lecture this evening, and he gave us several options, and I'm glad we chose this one, because the little bio he sent me intrigues me. His lecture this evening is based on his most recent book, The Fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist. This is published in 2017 by Beacon Press. And he has also continued to write about Benjamin Lay across several genres. Working with David Lester and Paul Buell, he's recently completed Profit Against Slavery, Benjamin Lay, a graphic novel. And in the old days, we called them comic books, but you probably know graphic novels themselves are now a serious form of literature. People have used them to talk about various issues, and including, it looks like, early abolitionism. And this graphic novel, A Prophet Against Slavery, is to be published also by Beacon Press this fall. Dr. Rediker is writing also a play about Benjamin Lay with playwright Naomi Wallace, and a book for 8-year-olds with children's book writer Michelle Markle. And he's also working with a film company to produce a TV series about Benjamin Lay. He finally says he is determined to restore the forgotten Benjamin Lay to historical and popular memory. And, you know, every little bit helps, I guess. So we're spreading the word a little bit in Nova Scotia, and we're just, I'll speak for myself, but I think all my colleagues too, just delighted, over the moon, that he agreed to do this talk for us. The Dangerous Mind of Benjamin Lay, Radical Abolitionist. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Rediker now.
Okay, Bob, thank you very much. Thanks to the History Department, thanks to the other sponsoring organizations or departments, programs within the university. It's a pleasure to be with you. I would love to be there in person, maybe at a warmer time of year, but perhaps that can happen at some point in the future. I want to begin with a big proposition, and that is, I'm going to tell you this evening about a person who might well be the most interesting historical figure you've never heard of. And that's this man, Benjamin Lay. So let's take a look at him. This is a portrait of Benjamin Lay that was painted around 1758. And I just want you to get a sense of his person. He did have dwarfism. He was about 4 feet tall. He probably weighed, I'm guessing, maybe 80 or 85 pounds. He also had a condition called kyphosis, the over curvature of the thoracic vertebrae of the back, or in popular parlance, he had a hunchback. And this man, you can see him here standing in front of a cave in Abington, Pennsylvania. He lived in a cave. And at the lower left, you can see a basket of fruits and vegetables. He was a vegan 200 years before that word was invented. So he was a man with a really unusual mind. And as I've called it in the title, he had a dangerous mind. He was considered to be a dangerous man by all kinds of powerful people. So the purpose of my talk really is twofold. I want to first of all talk about how Benjamin Lay acquired this dangerous mind. In other words, this is going to be kind of an intellectual history from below. History from below meaning people who were ordinary working people, how they shaped the course of history. Benjamin Lay, as we will see, is an ordinary working person, an elite in no sense. So how did he come to have this dangerous mind? That's the first point that I want to address. And the second point, which I'll come to in the conclusion, is basically to ask if Benjamin Lay is as important as I want to argue that he is, why have we never heard of him? So there's a bit of a mystery in all this. Here's a person who was literally hundreds of years ahead of his time, and yet we know almost nothing about him. So those are the two issues that I want to address in this talk. Let me begin with an event. And this is probably Benjamin Lay's greatest moment. The year is 1738. And there is a huge gathering of Quakers. He's a Quaker, a devoted Quaker, meeting in Burlington, New Jersey. This is the annual meeting of all Quakers from Pennsylvania and New Jersey. All of the so-called weighty Quakers, meaning the powerful Quakers, are there. And don't forget that Pennsylvania in 1738 is a Quaker colony, right? William Penn, the Quaker William Penn, was given a land grant from King Charles II. So Quakers ran this very prosperous colony. So the Quaker elite were the elites not only within the religious sphere, but also in the political sphere. Anyway, a lot of these Quakers, these wealthy Quakers, owned slaves. Very important to know this. Quakers came to America. The story is that they came to do good, and in fact, they did well. And when they did well and made money, they did what most other Europeans settling in North America did. They bought slaves. So Benjamin Lay goes to this meeting in Burlington, New Jersey, 1738, in order to deliver a prophecy. He considered himself a prophet along the model of the Old Testament of the Bible, in the idiom of Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, people who thundered these prophetic judgments. So in preparing to go to the meeting, Benjamin decides that he's going to appear in a particular way. So he puts on a military uniform. Now, this in itself is unusual because Quakers shortly after the English Revolution, 1660, 1661, dedicated themselves to what they call the peace principle. In other words, Quakers became as a group pacifists, opposed to war and weapons and all war making. So it's more than a little unusual that a devout Quaker like Benjamin Lay would dress up as a soldier. Now he takes it a step further. He not only dresses as a soldier, he buckles to his waist a belt, and attached to it is a sword. Okay, so he's not only a soldier, he is an armed soldier. The next thing he does is he takes a book. And I'm sure you've seen there are these books that they have a kind of secret compartment inside them where the interior part of the book has been carved out. He takes a book like that. He also takes an animal bladder and fills it up with bright red pokeberry juice. He ties off the top of that bladder. He puts the bladder inside the book, closes the book, and then he takes an overcoat and throws it over his shoulders so that no one can see the uniform, the sword, or the book. Excuse me. He goes into the big meeting. He makes sure to sit near these wealthy Quaker slave owners. He puts himself in a strategic position. And as some of you may know, Quakers, as a religion committed to equality, for the most part, don't have formal ministers. So people speak when the Spirit moves them. So people are speaking in this meeting, and Benjamin is quiet for a good long time. And finally, he is moved by the Spirit, and he stands up before literally these hundreds of people now. He stands up before hundreds of people, and he commands everybody's attention with a booming voice. Even though he was a small man, he had a booming voice. And what he says is, slavery is the greatest sin in the world. And just at that moment, he throws off his overcoat and reveals the uniform, the blade, and the book. And a collective gasp fills the Quaker meeting house. People are shocked. Then he takes the book and he holds it above his head, and he pulls the sword out of its scabbard. And he says, in a very threatening way, he says, God will take vengeance against those people who oppress their fellow creatures. And then he runs the sword through the book, and the bright red berry juice comes just down his arm. gurgling, and then he sprinkles the blood on the heads and bodies of the slave owners who are sitting nearby him. Total pandemonium breaks out in the Quaker meeting house. But Benjamin, the whole time, stands there, according to an eyewitness, as still as a statue, holding the book, the bloody book, and the blood is still oozing down his arm. He's standing there. There's total chaos and confusion, pandemonium. And then a group of Quaker men run up to where he's standing. They pick him up physically. Wasn't hard to do that. He was pretty small. They carry him to the door and they literally throw him out in the street, hoping that they are done with him. As it happens, he wasn't really done with them. It turns out this was a rainy day, very muddy in the unpaved street. So Benjamin went back and lay down just beneath the door of the main entry and exit for the Quaker meeting house, so that every person who left was going to have to step over his body as they exited the building. So the idea was, I'm putting my body on the line. I'm going to do whatever it takes to make Quakers realize that slavery is wrong, and that you, by owning slaves, are destroying Quakerism and you're destroying the entire society. Well, folks, this was one example among many of what I and others call guerrilla theater. This is something that a lot of people I know thought they invented back in the 1960s, where basically you act out a political idea in public so as to dramatize some sort of struggle that's going on. And Benjamin Lay did this about slavery in 1738. Now remember, this is 2 full generations before an anti-slavery movement emerges in Britain and the United States. So he is in many ways a lone voice crying in the wilderness, right? This is a time when very few people of European descent opposed slavery. And if they did oppose it, the only thing they said was, treat the enslaved people better. Benjamin says, no, I'm not saying treat them better. I'm saying free them now. So he ends up being one of the very first people in the world to call for a total emancipation, a complete unconditional emancipation of all enslaved people worldwide. One of the first to do this. He had actually already been an abolitionist for 20 years. He had become an abolitionist in the year 1718. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, about how that came to be. But here's a crucial point. Benjamin Lay was one of the first abolitionists, one of the first people to call for this global abolition. But he was also, and I want to emphasize this, a revolutionary abolitionist. And by that I mean his abolitionism, his opposition to slavery, was part of an even broader vision in which he imagined an entirely new way of living. He's basically saying you must live in an entirely new way. He has a different vision of the future. He has a critique of the slaughter of animals. He's a vegetarian, as I've already said. He has a critique of the mistreatment of women. He's an advocate of gender equality. He has a critique of wealth and class privilege. And he has a critique of capitalism. Now, they didn't call it capitalism in his day, but he has a critique of market society, of letting a market society dictate how you're supposed to live and what kinds of choices you're supposed to make. So he has a critique of all this, and this is really critical. So these folks are some of the basic elements of this dangerous mind that I've sketched out. And you can see it's a really unusual mind for this era. I do believe that most people thought it would have been impossible to combine a vision of gender equality and racial equality and class equality, and also, I might add, environmental justice. He was very big on the environment. To combine all of those ideas, many people thought that was only possible beginning in the 1970s. But this guy is doing it 2 centuries earlier. He's intersectional before that becomes a word, about the connections among the different kinds of oppression. So I think for those reasons, for many more, he really commands our attention. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do in this talk. I'm going to talk, first of all, about the chronology of his life, just to put that in place so you can see, when he was born, where he lived, what the basic phases of his life actually were. We'll get that in place. Then we're going to turn to the making of this very radical worldview. And there are 4 elements in that. I'll come to what they are in a moment. I want you to think of those 4 elements as like strands of a rope that come together. And when they come together, that then produces this extraordinarily militant and revolutionary worldview. Okay, so let's begin with Benjamin Lay's life, his chronology, his lifeline. He's born in England in a little village called Copford in the year 1682. 1682. This is 22 years after the English Revolution has ended. I'll say more about the origins of the Quakers in the English Revolution in a few moments, but he is a 3rd generation Quaker. He comes from his grandparents and his parents were both all Quakers. They are humble people. They're very small farmers. They have a little patch of land. Benjamin in his early years works as a shepherd because the area where he comes from, Essex, was a textile region. So he becomes a shepherd, and it's important to know that he really loved sheep. Benjamin had a lifelong love of sheep. He thought they were one of creation's most beautiful creatures, gentle, and so we may come back to that point too. But Benjamin was a rebel. He was a rebel to the bone. And even though he stood to inherit the family farm, a small farm, but to own any land at all in those days was really important and a basis for independence. Even though he stood to inherit the family farm, when he reached 21 years of age, he took off for the big city, which was London. Not very far away, only about 60 miles away. He went to London and he became a sailor. He signed on to a ship to go to sea. This is a very important decision that he made. Around 1703, Benjamin Lay becomes a sailor. Now you might wonder, how could a person of his size become a sailor? Well, apparently he was very strong, he was nimble, he was agile, he was able to climb up and down the ratlines of the ship. So he was a fully fledged common sailor. Okay, that's his phrase, a common sailor, an ordinary working sailor. He works at this for about 12 or 13 years. He finally leaves the sea in 1718. He meets a woman and falls in love with her. Her name is Sarah Smith. She is a working class girl from right along the Thames River at a place called Deptford. She is a Quaker, and she too has dwarfism. So this is a beautiful match. They get married, and Benjamin decides that he's going to leave the sea, partly to be with Sarah, but partly because seafaring is a really tough line of work. So in 1718, Benjamin and Sarah decide that they're going to leave London and move to Barbados in the Caribbean. This is a British colony at the time. It's also one of the world's leading sugar societies, producing vast wealth in sugar based on the institution of slavery. Barbados is one of the leading slave societies in the world. Now, Benjamin goes there. He and Sarah open a little shop on the waterfront just to sell things to sailors and artisans and people who work on the waterfront. But of course, lots of enslaved people come into their little shop. and Benjamin comes face to face with the institution of slavery. I'll say a lot more about that a little later on. He stays there for 2 years, whereupon he goes back to London, and he immediately rejoins the Quaker meeting in London, Devonshire House it's called, and he begins fighting with the wealthy Quakers. This is something he's going to do throughout his life. He decides, he and Sarah, that they should move again, so they move back to Essex, a city called Colchester, and he gets into more fights with these wealthy Quakers, especially over the issues of greed and what he calls covetousness, meaning you're avaricious, you're too much concerned with making money, you're too greedy, that's destroying our faith. So he fights with these Colchester Quakers, and then finally he decides in 1732, he and Sarah decide, because of their connections to a network of Quaker women, that they are going to migrate from England to Philadelphia to live in the Quaker colony. So they do that in 1732. They arrive in Philadelphia. Benjamin and Sarah are very excited about living in this Quaker colony where they think there will be peace and equality for all people. In 1734, he moves to a little town outside of Philadelphia called Abington. This is where his cave is located. It's actually fairly recently been found, should anybody want to visit it. And at this point in his life, Benjamin essentially goes back to the land. He starts making his own food. He cultivates his own land. He makes his own clothes. He and Sarah live a very simple life in this cave, which is actually quite close to the Quaker meeting house, and he is still very, very involved in the Quaker faith. So in 1738, Benjamin publishes a book. It's called All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage, Apostates. Now that's a slightly biblical phrase, but what it means is anybody who is a slave owner holding an innocent African in bondage is an apostate to Christianity and to Quakerism. In other words, you are undermining the faith. Okay, so this, folks, I must tell you, is a very strange book. It's not like any other book I've ever read. It is a mixture of all kinds of things. It's got, first of all, Benjamin's anti-slavery beliefs and the biblical passages that support his opposition to slavery. These are all laid out. He also lays out the story of his battles with the wealthy Quakers. But he also includes autobiography, different things about his life, and he includes a lot of commentary on the books he's reading, which is a great thing for a historian because you kind of see his mental world being formed. He publishes this in the year 1738. Everybody knew that it would be controversial. It was published by another Benjamin that I dare say you have heard of, the printer named Benjamin Franklin, the founding father. Normally, the printer of a book would put his name as the printer on the title page, but he didn't do that in this case because he knew that the wealthy Quakers were going to blow up once they saw this work, and they did. So Benjamin is disowned by his Quakers, partly because of his constant anti-slavery radicalism, partly because of the event that happened in Burlington, New Jersey, where he spattered this blood all over people, this fake blood, and partly because of this book. The leading Quaker in the entire colony runs a newspaper advertisement disavowing the book, saying that Benjamin Lay is no longer a member of the Quaker community. So he is disowned. And this, you should realize, was a very painful thing to him because he loved Quakerism. And to be kicked out of the Quaker meetings was really hard for him to accept. I mean, he suffered for his anti-slavery beliefs. Now, you would also need to know, though, that this disownment meant that he could not participate in what are called Quaker business meetings. In other words, the places where policy was decided. He couldn't participate in those meetings, but he could still participate in worship meetings. Quakers opened their meetings to everybody, even non-members now, like him, to come to worship. So he still attended, he still spoke out against slavery, he still harassed the wealthy Quakers, but he was no longer officially a member of the Quaker meeting. Okay, so he's disowned. He's disowned he's actually disowned 4 times by 4 different Quaker meetings. The last one in 1737, 38. So Benjamin continues to live a long life. He lives until 1759. I might add that it's somewhat unusual for people with dwarfism to live long lives. That condition frequently has many health challenges attached to it. He passes away in 1759 at the age of 77. He was the last Quaker disowned for his radical anti-slavery beliefs. In the years after Benjamin Lay is thrown out, the Quakers as a whole move towards anti-slavery, partly, I would say perhaps mainly because of his influence. And in 1758, they say you Quakers cannot participate in the slave trade. And in 1776, now Benjamin is already deceased by this time, they finally say Quakers cannot own slaves. So it took another 17 years after Benjamin passed away, but he did eventually win that battle. The Quakers became the first religious group to declare that they would not tolerate slavery in their own midst. So in that sense, Benjamin won. Okay, so let's circle back now and talk about the making of this this extraordinarily radical mind, this dangerous mind. I'm going to sketch out 4 sources of this radicalism. The first is what I call radical Quakerism. Okay, now most people don't know this, but Quakerism is originally a revolutionary faith. Quakerism emerged in the middle of the English Revolution. I won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but that is the battle that breaks out in 1640s in England between the supporters of the king, King Charles I, or the royalists, against the parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell. There is literally a military battle between the two. The king is deposed and eventually executed. And in this period of revolutionary ferment, many radical groups pop up. One of the things that happens is that once the king is overthrown, royal censorship is eliminated. So all kinds of people are free to come into print with radical solutions to the problems of the day. And so there are a whole host of really fascinating groups. They're called the Levelers, the Diggers, the Seekers, the Muggletonians. These are all radical Protestant groups. They stand for slightly different things, but they all pose really very radical solutions. The Levelers want to extend the idea of political equality. The Diggers want to retake the common land that's been enclosed by greedy landlords. So these are some of the groups, and it's important to remember that Quakers were part of all this. They were part of this revolutionary ferment. And the Quakers themselves, in their earliest days, were extremely radical. Extremely radical. It's also important to know that these groups, the Levelers, the Diggers, the Seekers, the Quakers, had a critique of slavery. Now, slavery wasn't yet racialized at that time, which means that when they spoke against slavery, they spoke against things like indentured servitude and impressment into the Army and Navy, conscription, loss of land, the loss of commons. But there was a kind of critique of slavery in place, and that is actually very important. Now, in 1660, King Charles II, the son of King Charles I, is restored to the crown, and all of these radical groups are basically sent scampering. Some of them go into exile. Many of them are harassed. The Quakers are harassed quite brutally, persecuted, because King Charles II knows that they were enemies of his father. Okay, now, I want to talk a little bit about the 2 sides of Quakerism. It turns out Quakers had a radical side and a moderate side. And these were embodied in two figures. The radical side was embodied by the man on the left named James Naylor, a really fascinating figure. The moderate side was basically embodied by the man who's considered the founder of modern Quakerism, George Fox. Now, many people today, many Quakers today don't know that in the 1650s, Naylor and Fox were basically equals in this movement. And Quakers themselves were extremely radical. They were what's often called antinomian radicals. That's a complicated word, but what it means is basically that you reject the law that rich men have made for their own protection. And you do what's right in the eyes of God. You do what's right according to a moral sense that you derive from your inward light. Quakers judge truth by this spark of divinity that is in all people. Well, to make a long story short, the radicals like Naylor provoked a crisis within Quakerism. Naylor went into Bristol, England, on the back of a donkey, basically replaying the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, with a whole group of Quaker women strewing flowers in his path. And this so terribly infuriates the Parliament that they spend several sessions debating whether to kill James Naylor or simply to beat him almost to death. They decide for the latter. He's lashed. They bore a hole through his tongue with a hot iron, and they brand a B on his forehead for blasphemer. George Fox is furious at Naylor. He thinks this is really hurting the religion. So he undertakes a whole series of reforms. Naylor goes to prison. Finally, he's released from prison, but he never really recovers from these punishments. He dies, but other radicals like him live on. And those radicals are actually very prominent in Essex, where Benjamin Lay grows up. So what I've argued in this book is that there's a continuity of radical Quakerism from James Naylor through other Quakers to Benjamin Lay. And Lay himself represents kind of a throwback to the original, more radical form of Quakerism. You could say that Benjamin Lay is the last radical of the English Revolution. And so this is one of the four strands of his radicalism, this very deep sort of Quaker radicalism that is out of step with the more moderate Quakerism of his own time. Okay, so that's the first strand, radical Quakerism. The second strand is maritime radicalism. We remember that Benjamin was a sailor from roughly 1700 to about 1703 to about 1714 or 15. He had a lifelong identity as a common sailor. Even years after he was no longer at sea, he still called himself a common sailor. In that book that I showed you, All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage, at one point in the book, Benjamin is aware that he doesn't have a lot of education. He's aware that the book is rather strange, and he apologizes to the reader, and he says, this is really all you could expect from a common sailor who had very little education. Okay, but here he is 25 years after he's left the sea, calling himself a common sailor. Now, this is important for many different reasons. If we go back to that cover, one of the things you'll see down below in the cover title, he says he's written this book for the happiness of all mankind, all the world over, of all colors and nations, as his own soul, meaning Benjamin Lay is a very cosmopolitan man. He's been around the world. He's seen people of all nations and all colors. So this is part of his authority in writing this book. It's literally part of who he is. He's also someone who has worked with sailors from other races and cultures. Seafaring labor was notoriously multi-ethnic in this day, and still is actually to this very moment. Benjamin, on any given ship, you could find English, Irish, French, Dutch, African, Greek, Native American sailors, people of many different ethnic groups working together. They have to work together, okay? This is a key because one of the aspects of the work culture of sailors is their sense of solidarity. Now, it's not hard to understand why they make this a central value, because on a brittle wooden ship, and you see here, this is a ship in a storm drawn by a contemporary of Benjamin Lay, a man named Edward Barlow. The sails have been ripped up by the winds. You can see how dangerous it is, right? You can see people in the water. These sailors trusted themselves, their lives to each other practically every day. So this work culture put a tremendous value on cooperation, collectivism, on being there for each other, one and all, as they used to say, on solidarity. Benjamin found a biblical phrase that expressed the same idea. He said, all people on earth are, quote, of one blood, end quote. So at a time when the world is being divided up according to race, Benjamin is insisting upon its unity, okay? Now, it's also important that when Benjamin was at sea, he first began to learn about slavery from his fellow sailors. Sailors would spin these yarns, and the stories that he heard on board the ships were some sailors themselves had been slaves. There were quite a few English slaves in the Mediterranean held by Islamic powers like Turkey or Algiers. So some of the Benjamin shipmates had been slaves themselves. Some of his shipmates had actually been on slave ships, and they told the stories of how horrible that was. These stories made a very big impression on Benjamin. So in a sense, his education about slavery also begins at sea. So work, culture, solidarity, these are part of maritime radicalism, and they permit Benjamin to see things that other people can't see. For example, he's one of the first people to say that slave traders, the merchants who organized the slave trade, they are murderers. Now, how does he know this? Because he knows that death is a chronic part of the slave trade. On every slaving voyage, some significant percentage of the enslaved people die and are thrown overboard to the sharks that followed the vessels all the way across the Atlantic. He knew about this. He knew that Quaker merchants were involved in the slave trade. So he says, you Quaker merchants, you are murderers. You've killed thousands of people. He said, you've probably killed hundreds of thousands of people. And if you look at the very moment at which Benjamin makes this really kind of startling statement, you'll see that 500,000 Africans had already died in the African slave trade. He knew exactly what he was talking about. He basically charged these slave trading merchants with being guilty of murder. Okay, now, so maritime radicalism. Before we leave this, I want to show you something that's kind of about the joy of research. As I'm working on this book, I find out that Benjamin Lay, who was a book lover himself, inside his cave, he had a library of about 200 volumes, which is a very big library for that time. I found out that one of his books from his library was in a small archive in Germantown, Pennsylvania. So off I ran to see it, and with great excitement. And so I get there, and it turns out that the book, in a bold hand, it says, this book belongs to Benjamin Lay. That's him. He wrote his name in it because he liked to loan out his books and he wanted people to bring them back. The book itself was a set of radical sermons by an English revolutionary named William Dell. So imagine how important it is to have a dialogue between a 17th century radical and an 18th century radical. And then lo and behold, what I discover is that Benjamin has written marginal comments all through the book. So he's literally in dialogue with William Dell. And I just want to give you this one example. This comes from a page in which William Dell, who was actually the master of a Cambridge college, a very educated radical. He was a seeker, by the way, to go back to those groups we mentioned. He's saying that it's very hard work to bring the real radical truth of Christianity to people, and that some people just aren't strong enough to do it. And Dell calls himself, using a biblical phrase, a bruised reed. A bruised reed is something that won't hold up the weight of the reed itself. So Benjamin Lay is reading this, and he writes, I'll read it to you. In his handwriting, if so great a man as William Dell called himself a bruised reed, which now he's saying he is a master of a college at the University of Cambridge. If that man considers himself a bruised reed, Benjamin Lay writes, what may I call myself that was a common sailor and no more? So again, there's that identity of Benjamin Lay as a common sailor. So this is strand number 2 in the making of the dangerous mind. You've got Quaker radicalism, and now you've got maritime radicalism, and especially its sense of solidarity. What Benjamin is going to do with that idea of solidarity is expand it beyond sailors and say that we need to give solidarity to all people who work in unjust conditions. And that, of course, means first and foremost enslaved people. So that's the second of these strands of rope. The third comes when Benjamin and Sarah go to Bridgetown, Barbados. I've told you they opened a little shop there. He lives on the waterfront. And as I said, he comes face to face with slavery. And he is shocked by what he sees. On Sundays, the one day of the week when many enslaved people had a day off, they would come into Barbados, sometimes to try to sell some produce they had created in their own gardens, but they would come into Benjamin's little shop. Some of them were so gaunt and so starved, like their rib cages astir, they would literally collapse. They would faint right there in his shop. And he was shocked to see this. He was shocked to see the level of violence in Barbados. He saw people being whipped on a daily basis. He saw people being tortured. This was just daily life in Barbados, which was 90% enslaved Africans, 10% white, and 1% the wealthy slave owners who commanded most of the wealth. Okay, so he's seeing this on a daily basis. He's confronted now with the reality of slavery. He meets people, he befriends people on the docks. He talks to enslaved people. One man he knows commits suicide rather than face another arbitrary flogging by his master. These things make a tremendous impact on Benjamin Lay. He sees industrial accidents. You know, sugar production is very industrial. There's a lot of machinery that's used in processing the sugar cane. He sees that people's hands and legs get caught in the machinery. He sees that, as abolitionists will later say, sugar is made with blood, the blood of enslaved Africans. So what does he do? He and Sarah, they do what they think they can do. They start inviting enslaved people to come to their home on Sunday afternoons, and they start preparing food for them. Like a pastor, he wants to feed the hungry. But the word gets out among the enslaved Africans, and they begin showing up at this tiny little shop and home by the hundreds in order to get food, and also to hear Benjamin and Sarah denounce the source of their misery, to denounce the institution of slavery. Now, as you can imagine, it doesn't take long for the news of this to get back to those wealthy slave owners. So they start menacing Benjamin and Sarah. They start saying that they're going to banish them from the island. Benjamin and Sarah do decide to leave. They're so disturbed by what they see They decide to go back to London, but they are forever transformed by this experience in Barbados. Benjamin's, this is the third strand of rope, and in some ways the most powerful one. He becomes an abolitionist in 1718, and he will be an abolitionist for the remaining 41 years of his life. This will be the central issue of his life, to do everything he can to abolish slavery. So that is number 3. That's the third strand of rope. The fourth is what I called commoning. Benjamin going back to the land. He believed that we must live life on what he called, this is a direct quote, the innocent fruits of the earth. And by that he meant food that was produced with no human exploitation and no animal exploitation, right? He was a defender of animals. Now, this is really crucial. He lived in this cave. He made his own food. He made his own clothes, because he thought if you buy clothing from somebody else, who knows who was under what conditions forced to make that clothing. He refused to consume any item that was made with slave labor. He would not consume sugar. He would not consume tobacco. He would not consume tea, which he knew was made by very poor workers in India. And he is the first person to see that the boycott might be a very important thing to a social movement. He's the first to boycott these slave-produced items. This will become one of the major tactics of the anti-slavery movement in the 19th century. The boycott of sugar is really crucial. Benjamin is doing that. He makes his own clothes. Sailors were very good with needles and cloth because they spent a lot of time sewing canvas sails. He made his own clothes. So what we see here is a return to nature, or as he put it, living life in accordance with nature. Part of this was to say, and this is another quotation, Benjamin said, beware of rich men, notice this, who poison the earth for gain. And that sounds like a phrase somebody made up last week, but he's saying this in 1738. It's really extraordinary. So who is an inspiration for this? So it turns out there's a surprising inspiration. It's an ancient Greek philosopher named Diogenes, who was the leading figure in a philosophical movement called the Cynic philosophy. They believed in life according to nature, but they also believed in what they called parrhesia, or speaking truth to power. You must always tell the truth to powerful people. You must always stand up to them. And moreover, you must enact your ideas in public, which you will now see, going back to where we started this talk, is exactly what Benjamin did in 1738. He enacted his anti-slavery ideas in public, right in the face of the most powerful people in the colony. And it's kind of curious that this pagan philosopher Diogenes was such a powerful influence on Benjamin Lay. But I do think this is the fourth strand of radicalism. So he combines vegetarianism, animal rights, boycotts, environmental consciousness, and also a kind of politics of consumption. The idea that you are what you eat, or you are what you consume. The idea now in the movement against global sweatshops is, think of the workers who made this for 17 cents an hour in Indonesia or China or Vietnam. Benjamin Lay had that same idea 3 centuries ago, okay? So that's the fourth and final strand of rope. When you put them all together, what you get is a revolutionary mind. This is what enabled Benjamin Lay to make a breakthrough that many of his contemporaries could not do, combining radical Quakerism, seafaring radicalism, the struggles of Africans and African Americans, and finally the philosophy of the Cynics. All of these things came together and made him the person that he was. I call this enlightenment from below. Benjamin Lay is a very different kind of Enlightenment figure than, say, Thomas Jefferson, whose wealth was based, as everyone knows, on slavery. Benjamin Lay had a very radical and different view of slavery. So, okay, so that's how it all comes together. Now the question is, briefly and in conclusion, why is he still so unknown? If this man is so important, the first revolutionary abolitionist, basically espousing ideas that we only 300 years later are just now catching up to, why is it that we don't know more about him? Well, the beginnings of this story of repression must go back to the Quakers themselves, because they disowned Benjamin Lay. They did everything they could to isolate him. They tried to prevent the spread of his ideas. There was a Quaker oversight committee that Benjamin Lay knew would never allow him to publish his book. So he went straight to Benjamin Franklin and paid Benjamin Franklin himself to publish it. So basically the Quakers themselves bear a very serious responsibility. And if anyone wants to discuss in the Q&A, it is interesting what Quaker meetings have done more recently as they've been confronted with Benjamin Lay and his history. They've done some very interesting things, and I'd be happy to talk about that. So that's the first point, the Quakers. But the second point, and this is probably even more crucial, the stories that historians have told about the movement for the abolition of slavery was very different than the one that I've told you here this evening. Anti-slavery is basically a middle and upper class movement of enlightened gentlemen. It's not for working class people like Benjamin Lay. It's not for people who use such radical militant tactics as Benjamin Lay. So basically Benjamin Lay was essentially read out of the story of abolition. And I'll just give you one example. Probably the leading historian of the Atlantic abolition movement, the late David Bryan Davis, dismissed Benjamin Lay as, quote, a demented little hunchback, end quote. I mean, that's a pretty shocking thing to say. But the truth is Benjamin Lay had a tremendous impact. Part of that impact was linking the revolution of England of the 1640s to the American Revolution of the 1770s and making anti-slavery part of this Atlantic-wide revolution of the 1790s, leading eventually to the abolition of the slave trade, the revolution in Haiti, and many other things. So Benjamin Lay is still, I think, a very important person for us. And I'll just conclude by saying that after I published the book in 2017, a lot of interesting things began to happen. And there was one thing that happened without my knowledge or participation. A new group called the Benjamin Lay Society was formed in Philadelphia. And they have basically one political demand, which is that those of you who have been to Philadelphia might know, City Hall has on top of it a statue of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. But most people don't know that William Penn was a slave owner, like most of those early wealthy Quakers. So the Benjamin Lay Society now wants to do something different. They want to put a statue of Benjamin Lay on City Hall. And I must say, I think that's a great idea. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
And hi, thank you. Am I talking now? Are you hearing me?
I'm hearing you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Everybody at St. FX knows me and technology are sometimes not on speaking terms. I just want to thank Marcus Rediker, Dr. Rediker. So many ideas percolating in my head. I see a lot of questions, and I've been commenting, but my comments I'll leave alone, in the chat room. So maybe, can we surface some of those chat room questions and then maybe continue using the chat room to answer questions, or do people want to use the mics? But I see a bunch of questions already in the chat room, so maybe I'll just try to paraphrase some of those first.
That sounds good, Bob.
Yeah, okay. So these were just comments right in the beginning, though, but Michaela Woodward said, "Act up, anyone?" and making, some parallels, I think, apt to that kind of direct action. And Sully said guerrilla theater, and later commented that this is kind of conscientious consumerism. And Robin Neustaller, if I'm saying the surname right, great nonviolent action. But I guess I'd just press that a little. I agree, nonviolent, but and we know in our own day and age, though, sometimes assaults on private property or the status quo gets paralyzed or stigmatized, I should say, as violence. I'm thinking of, again, Black Lives Matter. So maybe just some comments of those lines, and they're more just comments, but questions of is this indeed the first kind of direct action with parallels we've got in our own age that Benjamin Lay is engaged in?
Well, I thank you, Bob, and thanks to the people who made those very good comments. Act up, absolutely. This is if we were to construct a genealogy of guerrilla theater, Act Up would be a very significant part of it. A new politics of consumption, absolutely. Benjamin Lay wants people to be conscious of what they're consuming. Bob, I don't think this is by any means the first in sort of highly dramatic attacks on property. I mean, those have been going on for centuries by the time Benjamin Lay gets to it. But I think they are among the first having to do specifically with the institution of slavery. So now Benjamin Lay didn't, he did several, I could give you some more examples of other kinds of guerrilla theater he performed. And it's really kind of fascinating how he did that. But I think his view was to attach this radical point of view to a cause that is going to grow and become one of the most important things in all of Atlantic history. Now, I mentioned that Benjamin Lay was a prophet, right? Here's one of the things that he said in his book. He said, if you don't eliminate slavery, he said, this will be like the poison of dragons in your society moving forward. It will be poison. And I think that's actually literally true. We still have the poison of slavery in us. And a lot of the protests of the past year about racial justice are trying to get the poison out. Benjamin Lay saw that coming.
Yeah, thank you. I would, and point well taken. I mean, I like that you talked about, and of course you would, the diggers, levelers, and ranters. My students suffer through me trying to get them to sing Stand Up Now, and it never happens, but I sing it. And I just wonder too, that maybe that hyper radicalism, that the levelers were not just against the monarchy, but they took it to, okay, private property itself. When even Adam Eve first spun, who was the gentleman, is a step too far that people are unwilling to take. And perhaps that's why Benjamin Lay is not remembered, abolitionists who say, once we get rid of slavery, everything else is okay. We can still have class differences and whatever, is a little more palatable, perhaps, to not just historians, but the wider society. Okay, now we have a question from Daniel Seeger. As a friend myself, I would like to know, is there any connection between Benjamin Lay and John Wollman? And somebody else says they were contemporaries, but I wonder if they ever heard of each other or interacted.
I really like this question. Thank you. I am quite sure that John Wollman was in the Quaker meeting house the day that Benjamin Lay spattered the blood. But he never mentioned it. In fact, John Wollman doesn't mention Benjamin Lay at all in his writing, and I want to tell you why. Benjamin Lay was a deliberately polarizing figure. His strategy for making change was basically to say, I'm going to come into this meeting and I'm going to draw a line, and I want to know, which side are you on? Are you for slavery or are you against it? There is no middle ground. And Benjamin Lay infuriated a lot of Quakers by doing this. They're constantly saying to him, Benjamin, you're too extreme. You're being too hard on people. He said, I'm sorry, somebody's got to do it. So John Wollman, who is a very powerful figure in the Quaker movement against slavery, took almost exactly the opposite point of view. You could argue that he was in some ways the anti-Benjamin Lay. He would go into the homes of Quaker slave owners, and he would speak with them very quietly, and he would cry with them, and he would encourage them. And Benjamin Lay was all kind of thunder and lightning and Old Testament prophecy. John Wollman was completely different, but I think it took both kinds in order to make this happen. Because one of the things that's going on while Benjamin Lay is still the leading voice against slavery. Now, John Wollman will emerge as a leading voice in the 1750s, and Benjamin Lay is still alive for most of that decade. But recent scholarship has shown that the real change in the heart and minds of Quaker rank and file is happening in the 1730s and the 1740s, when Benjamin Lay is the leading figure. So that by the time Wollman comes onto the scene, a lot of Quakers are already convinced. So I guess I have great admiration for John Wollman, but I do think that the Quakers need to make more room for Benjamin Lay. John Wollman is very well remembered within that tradition. Benjamin Lay needs to be remembered too.
Yeah, okay. And I'm from Jersey, but North Jersey, but also, yeah, Burlington and South Jersey were, correct me if I'm wrong, started as a Quaker colony as well. And I certainly know they celebrate Wollman and others down there. Okay, my colleague in English, Maureen Moyna, on the talk says, given the position against human and animal exploitation, and Lay's anti-slavery position and his positions on gender, et cetera, I'm curious to know what his position on the colonization of indigenous people was. Is there any evidence of his meeting with indigenous people, or any evidence of his taking any positions on that question?
Another really good question. There's frustratingly little evidence about that, but here's what we know. Benjamin Lay was proud of the fact that the Quakers made treaties with the indigenous peoples of this region, and I think it was Voltaire who said that the original Quaker treaty may have been the only one that was never broken. Now, the Quakers lost control of Pennsylvania fairly early on, and lots of very aggressive settlers moved into indigenous lands by the middle of the 18th century. So that reality is changing. One thing that interests me is that one of Benjamin's proteges, a man named Joshua Morris, played a leading role in trying to defend indigenous people from these very militaristic settlers, the sort of settler colonizers. So I can only extrapolate by saying that Benjamin believed in spiritual equality. He had respect for all religions. He would have had respect for native peoples, and I dare say he would have been very interested in what their beliefs actually were, but we just don't have the evidence to be more specific about that.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that made me think. I lived in Philly for 7 years, and William Penn, again, it's one of the, I guess I'd say, relics, religious, secular religious relics, the desk on which William Penn and the natives worked out a voluntary treaty, right, is still, I think, in Independence Hall or someplace. Okay, Donna Trumbinsky, my colleague in history, I would like to ask about Benjamin and Sarah's time in Barbados. Did they see their decision to leave as a failure of a sort? What finally pushed them to leave and go back to London? Was it the slave owners? And a second question about Sarah, Benjamin's wife. Was she participating in public acts of radicalism, or were there quieter acts of radicalism for Sarah?
Yes, it's difficult to be certain about exactly what the motivations were when Benjamin and Sarah leave. I think it was certainly pressure from the slave owners. That was part of it. I think it was also anger at their fellow Quakers, because many of them were slave owners. And there's a particularly important story that involves Sarah Lay. Sarah went without Benjamin to visit a Quaker friend in Speightstown, which is just north of Bridgetown. And when she got there, she found an African man who was literally strung up with a pool of blood below his body on the ground. And she was just frozen in horror. And she went into the Quaker household and said, "What is this?" And the Quaker said, "The man ran away and he's got to be punished." And Sarah was just so horrified that a Quaker could do this. I think it really rattled her. I think they didn't want to be part of that community anymore. They felt like it was corrupt. So they did leave. I think they felt some guilt about leaving, because that meant that they weren't going to be there to support people, but they weren't going to be able to last very long in any case. And to Donna, I did everything I could to find out everything and anything about Sarah Lay. There's not a lot to go on, but we do know she passed away well before Benjamin. She was a little older than Benjamin to begin with. She died in 1735. The memorials and the like suggested that she was every bit as committed to anti-slavery as Benjamin was. She was known as an abolitionist, but she was never disowned. In other words, I think what you talk about quieter acts of radicalism, I think that's a very good description of Sarah.
Right.
She always defended Benjamin and his more dramatic acts, but she was seen as a very well-respected person and someone who could actually represent a Quaker meeting by traveling to other Quaker meetings. So she was a very respected member of the community, but Benjamin was just too difficult.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, and I apologize if I've skipped over somebody. I see a private message to me. Shiraz Ramji has their hand up. Shiraz, if you're still with us, and I think you can unmic yourself. I don't see the question. Do you want to just ask Dr. Rediker?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm a Quaker, and I just heard about your lecture today through a friend of mine in the Facebook. My question is that the American Friends Service Committee was quite involved in challenging the American Vietnam War. And so in my meetings, I always find we are always divided because we are not a homogeneous group. I mean, some of us, and it's of all social class. So in the meetings, we often find that some of us were labeled radicals, and we would challenge the conservatives in the Quaker meeting in terms of the Quakers' opposition to talk about issues of justice. So my question is, how does American Friends Service Committee historically followed Benjamin's ideas, or were they part of the middle and upper class Quakers? And what do you think of American Quakers Friends Service Committee now? Thank you.
Thank you, Shiraz. I think that there have always been very serious class divisions among Quakers. This was one of the things that Benjamin Lay was very concerned about. He felt like the wealthy Quakers and all of their property and worldly goods were corrupting the faith. So this is not unusual. This goes way back, this problem. He felt like there had to be lots of internal debate. And of course, the Quakers tried to silence him. With regard to the American Friends Service Committee, actually, as it happens, two of my friends, Stoughton and Alice Lind, were very active in the American Friends Service Committee in draft counseling during the war in Vietnam in the 1960s. And I think that, I don't know that they had Benjamin Lay's ideas in mind, but I do know that they had this larger body of radical ideas from that era in mind, because the central idea of draft resistance was the same idea that I mentioned earlier about antinomians. You are not obliged to obey laws that rich men make for their own purposes. You must instead obey your conscience. So in that sense, I see a real continuity from the kind of things that James Naylor and Benjamin Lay did up to that era, when I think the radicalism, see this radical spirit in Quakerism has kind of always been there, but it sort of explodes at different moments when there are movements that kind of give it life. And I'm happy to say that the Quakers now have a very big racial justice campaign that's going to be initiated. The American Friends Service Committee is going to be holding a meeting next month in which I and several other people will be speaking about the history of Quakerism, the history of race and slavery. So it will be interesting to see how Quakers respond to the current moment, and whether that more radical side of Quakerism might be revived once again.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, terrific. Oh, wow. So going down the list again, and I really apologize if I'm, skipping over. I'm going to try to hit them all. And if I miss you, jump on the mic. It's kind of like a Quaker meeting. If the spirit moves you, just get in there. But Michaela Woodward says, are there any comparisons here to John Brown? Seems like another fraught relationship to the quote, Enlightenment gentleman camp of abolitionists, among other things. And I would just throw in there, I was thinking, of course, Brown, I don't want to, you, Dr. Rediker, please. But of course, Brown eventually said, no, a gun is needed here. But even nonviolent abolitionists were characterized in their own age in the US, and then even by the historical profession. Thaddeus Stevens was called by historians into the 1960s an unbalanced man for believing in racial equality as an abolitionist. And that I thought of as you were describing the denigrated description of Benjamin Lay. So yeah, any parallels there?
No, I actually say at the end of the book that Benjamin Lay is an ancestor of John Brown. Even though you might think that their methods were so radically different, the truth is that they drew on a similar body of radical religious ideas. And the other thing is that they both believed in extremely militant methods. So Benjamin Lay was nonviolent, but the symbolism of his actions was actually quite violent and extremely confrontational. So that confrontational spirit, that idea of always speaking truth to power, I really think that is one of the things that connects Benjamin Lay to John Brown and to many other kinds of radicals. And of course, Bob, it's absolutely true that people are always trying to demean and dismiss people who have revolutionary ideas as mentally unbalanced. People said this about Benjamin Lay in his own day. They said his brain is cracked. The truth is, his ideas are extremely rational, and you can see exactly where they come from. It's not hard to understand them, but this is a constant tactic used against people who propose the most radical ideas and the most radical tactics. There's an effort to marginalize them by declaring them as insane.
Yeah, I was thinking of a great book, which I'm sure you know, Men, Mob, and Laws, and Rebecca Hill says, isn't it interesting when John Brown picks up a gun, suddenly people are anti-gun and anti-violence in the US in 1859. Where did that come from? Okay. So a question from Salman Mirza, Solidarity from the UK. A question, are there social movements after the Biden win in the US which extends the Black Lives Matter movement to class and revolution. Bernie Sanders seemed to be the electoral representative for BLM, but never got there.
Okay, I want to give a shout out to Salman. I haven't seen you for quite a while. We've known each other for years, and it's very good to hear from you. Thank you for this question. I actually think that I'm fairly optimistic about the future of social movements in this country, because I think we have finally gotten to the point where there is a very broad-based understanding of the need for a deep reckoning with the legacy of slavery. I've been talking and writing about this for years, but suddenly, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and with this huge controversy over the statues of Confederate generals, we've had a lot of history lessons. And so now more than ever, we need to know what kinds of movements there existed in the past. What was the nature of the anti-slavery movement? How can that be useful to the present? What kinds of tactics worked and what kinds of tactics didn't? So I think the key to progressive change from below, it will continue to be these movements maintaining their autonomy outside the political parties and putting great pressure on them to move leftward. And I think that is happening. I think it's actually already happened. I think one of the things that Bernie Sanders did with the movement that grew up around his candidacy was to move all of the Democratic parties to the left. So we'll just have to see how it plays out. But this is one of the amazing things about history from below. The protests about George Floyd, nobody saw those coming. And then suddenly we're in this, probably one of the most powerful moments of anti-racism we've ever encountered, ever experienced. What's the future of that? I don't know. It's going to depend on protests and what we do. But I think there are some good reasons for optimism.
Yeah. And Shiraz also said, can you share the life of his wife? Was she allowed to attend Quaker meetings? And Penny Burrell said, women were always equal in Quaker meetings, is my understanding. I'm a Quaker. We covered a bit Sarah's life, but what was her status within some of these meetings?
Yeah, it is absolutely true that gender equality was more pronounced among Quakers than maybe any other group in this era. There was a principle of all souls being equal, and this applied to gender, to race, to class. And I think Quakers were known for treating women differently. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a powerful thing called Quaker patriarchy, because I think there still is. And one of the things that Benjamin used to do, one of the things he did on one occasion was, men and women were segregated in Quaker meetings in his era, and he went and sat in the women's section. This freaked all the men elders out. He went and sat with the women. He was kind of transgressing that sort of boundary. Sarah, as I've said, was not as confrontational, but she was a very committed abolitionist, and I think she probably had every bit as great an effect in building a nascent movement as Benjamin did. In other words, it takes many different kinds of people with different kinds of tactics in order to build a movement. And there was a movement growing when Benjamin and Sarah were alive. Now, Benjamin himself makes it a little hard to see that, because he frequently speaks about himself as the lone prophet crying in the wilderness. But the truth is that a lot of people agreed with him, especially poor Quakers. The ones, they didn't like slavery, they had no vested interest in it, and they supported him, but they were afraid of the wealthy Quakers. So Benjamin took it as his job, and I think Sarah probably did too, to get them to speak out, to stand up to the wealthy Quakers. And I think, Sarah Lay was probably every bit as important to building that movement as Benjamin was.
Wow, great. Yeah, and my colleague, and we are coming to the end. And of course, when we were able to do these in 3 dimensions, we would then say it's time to have some wine and cheese and continue the conversation, inshallah, in years to come, a few of us anyway. But Dr. Semple, my colleague, asks, or first says, I want to mention Professor Jeff Cox, who was a radical Quaker and witnessed every Friday against government injustice. He would have loved this. We had him come up here, forget how many years ago. But she wonders, could you talk about disability? Would you consider Benjamin and Sarah disabled? It doesn't seem like his body slowed him. Maybe it actually contributed to his ability to be a radical critic.
Yes, thank you. I do believe also that this idea of bearing witness does have very deep Quaker roots, and it's something that's kind of more or less well accepted idea of radical practice these days. Quakers had a big impact on these kinds of things. Yes, Benjamin and disability. Benjamin and Sarah were little people, and I think this is a very important part of the story. Now, Benjamin didn't say a lot about that. He does say that he was mocked, he was ridiculed, that people laughed at him, that they insulted him. He thought that was not only because of his body type, to be frank, but also because of the ideas that he held. So people were very eager to try to dismiss him. But I think that in some very deep ways, you see, for Benjamin and Sarah, living a life of equality in which you were treated the same way by all people was a daily struggle because of their bodies. They had to fight for it, and they fought for it. And I think this is really important. I also think that being part of a marginalized group enhanced their sympathy for other people who suffered different kinds of discrimination and oppression. So there's no doubt in my mind, Benjamin saw all these things as related: the discrimination against women, the discrimination against the poor, the discrimination against the enslaved, the discrimination against little people. He saw all these things as related, and there's no doubt in my mind that he drew great strength from the fact that he had overcome some of those limitations. I don't have evidence that he considered himself to be disabled, but I think there is absolutely no doubt that he was a person who achieved great things, and great things on behalf of little people. And in fact, one of my favorite reviews of this book, the book I wrote, was by a little person activist named Eugene Grant in the UK, in which he said, I learned about the 7 dwarves when I was very young, but it took 30 odd years for me to learn about Benjamin Lay. And he says, I'm going to tell my children stories about Benjamin Lay. So I think he is an inspiring example. He's somebody who refused to accept any sort of mistreatment, no matter what the cause. Bob, I can't hear you. Bob, you're muted.
I'm muted. And 3 more, just real fast. This intriguing question. What led you to explore this story of Benjamin Lay, and how did you come to it and want to get his story and example out there to a wider public?
You know, I found Benjamin Lay as Peter Linebaugh and I were writing a book called The Many-Headed Hydra years ago, back in the 1990s. And we were studying a wave of revolts in the 1730s. There were a bunch of slave revolts and other kinds of resistance from below. We wanted to see if those revolts had any impact on anti-slavery writing. So I read Benjamin Lay's book, and they did have an impact on Benjamin Lay. But once I found him, I thought he was so fascinating. I said to myself, this man really deserves his own book. Now, I went on and wrote several other books in between, but I came back around to him finally and decided, I guess I started working on this book around 2014 or so. I kind of felt like Benjamin Lay was a right person for that moment. And I hope that he will continue to be.
All right, and these I'm going to lump two right one after the other, kind of in one question. Benjamin Lay seems to be theologically advanced. What evidence did he use to argue his position against slavery? And then Leo Doyle asks, who were his first followers other than his wife? Did he have any effect on later theological abolitionists or other people?
Okay, yeah, he was theologically advanced, and he does produce a lot of arguments against slavery, which are going to become very common. Now, he wasn't the only one who used them. So I would say that his primary influence is not necessarily theological, but in terms of the actions that he took. I don't think that his ideas probably influenced subsequent theology because, to be perfectly honest, his book is really hard to read. It's a very unusual book. It's hard to read, but he understood this. He thought, if I can visually dramatize my ideas, act out these ideas against slavery, people will talk about those ideas. And that is exactly what happened. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, an abolitionist and physician in Philadelphia later in the 18th century, wrote the first biography of Benjamin Lay and said that in his day, he was the most famous person in all of Pennsylvania. It wasn't because of his book, it was because of his acts. It was because of the guerrilla theater, and he knew that that was going to happen. So I think his example of resistance and militant opposition is the thing that allowed him to have an impact among Quakers, and especially, as I've said, among poorer Quakers. It was the propertied Quakers who had trouble with him.
Okay, and thank you. And I have reserved my prerogative. Last question is from Wa. You were talking about, again, these kind of sailor radical culture and egalitarian, you have to rely on your mates and they are a multiracial workforce. But also there is this whole question of the broadly defined artisan intellectual. And I've read a lot, I do much later stuff, right? But like these sailors or timber beasts or whoever who had these phenomenal, when you talked about 200 book libraries, lending libraries, and they were self-taught intellectuals. Stan Weir talks about being a merchant seaman, and this is probably horrible, but he would throw trashy novels out the porthole so that people were bored on the ship and had nothing to read, and he'd say, here, you got to read Karl Marx or whoever. But my question is, can you speak to Benjamin Lay in that artisan, self-taught worker, intellectual tradition? And is the fact that he sinks like a stone part of a class bias, even among abolitionists? We'll listen to somebody from Cambridge, but who's this guy?
Yeah, no, I think, Benjamin Lay, like many Quakers, was opposed to the idea of pride. Pride was a sin, and he tried to avoid it. But the one thing he could not resist being proud of was the development of his own ideas. He was very, very proud of his ideas. He fought for them, he developed them, he didn't come into this world with advantages. So I would say he really is an excellent example of what you mentioned, Bob. He's kind of an organic intellectual of the working class. His working class experience is a very big part of the person he became. In fact, this is one of the themes of the book. I look at the different work experiences that Benjamin Lay had and link them to the development of the ideas, being a shepherd, being a glove maker, being a sailor. All those things really did have the labor that he did had a big impact on what he became. And to me, this is one of the most exciting areas of history, this kind of intellectual history from below. When you start treating ordinary working people as thinkers, you have a very different kind of intellectual history. Lawrence Levine, the great figure from years ago, taught at Berkeley, said intellectual history is the history of people thinking. So the question is, how do we study that for people who don't leave us very many documents of their own. This is one of the big themes that I've tried to address really my entire career as a writer, to get at the ideas down below. And Benjamin Lay seemed to me to be such a good example of that, because he did write a book. A lot of people did write about him, partly because they were so furious at him, and that it would be possible to excavate his ideas and show where they came from. This kind of work on Benjamin Lay can be done for all kinds of thinkers, past and present. You know, we have a lot of people with real ideas and we don't recognize them as thinkers. So I think this he's part of a very long tradition of autodidacts, self-educated people, people who learn to critique the society that they grew up in. And I think we should really honor him for that.
Yeah, I would just say here, and I think I've hit all the question. And of course, you know, art is what is that? Life is long and art is longer or shorter. We can't go on all night. I just want to say though to everybody, there's a few people asking, will this be recorded? It is being recorded. If Dr. Rediker says delete it, we will honor that, but we did want to make this available. What I will say to people, and I think I'm correct in this on other kind of these Zoom conferences, all the chat, unfortunately, is not recoverable. So look at the chat now. There are some comments that you might want to jot down. There's somebody has hot types quakerservice.ca, the Canadian Friends Service Committee Social Justice Branch of Canadian Quakers, because I don't think we can, you know, preserve that with the recording, and will be accessible. The history department or society will make that somehow available. But look there, and I will just say there's plenty of nice things, deservedly so, being said about this talk from the attendees. There's also from Salman Misra again, saying the Quaker movement in the UK have a strong commitment to defending refugees. I have to say Marcus is an incredible historian who demystifies history for ordinary people like me, who are trade union activists. I've quoted him on many occasions at union and campaign meetings. And then the little smiley emoticon. History is not yesterday, it's today and interconnected. Here. And you guys in the US are lucky to have him. Today, we in Canada, we're very lucky to have Dr. Rediker with us. If I've left anybody off and anybody wants to grab the mic and ask one last fast question, but I think I've hit everybody. And let me just say, and the whole room would be doing that, I'm sure.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely night. And Marcus, you and I will keep the dialogue going, and I'll email you and we'll work out the nuts and bolts on this. But thank you very much. And I only regret we could not be doing it in person. But this was a terrific event.
Thank you.